Before One Piece chapter 1097 reveals that Dragon and Ivankov came to liberate Sorbet Kingdom and free Kuma and Ginny, it builds up to the reveal with a couple of techniques at once. There's the slow progression of silhouettes, first in profile then from the front, before we see them in their full glory. But my favorite way that it builds it up is with the careful choices of what it shows. Kuma and Ginny are in jail right now. Everything shown on the outside is fundamentally something they could hear. A bomb going off in the city, the sound of people cheering as they're liberated. Kuma and Ginny would naturally be able to tell that something is happening without understanding exactly what while being trapped in there. Kuma and Ginny would be able to tell that something is happening outside, but not know exactly what until Dragon and Kuma show up to liberate them. The page could have just showed us the fight for liberation directly. It could have just shown us Dragon and Ivankov from the start saving everybody. But instead, by keeping it more vague, these panels give us a feeling of slight tension, putting us in the minds of Kuma and Ginny, instead of showing it to us from the outside. We see Ivankov and Dragon face to face only when our protagonists do. But of course, you probably recognize them from the silhouettes, you probably already knew it would be them. Hell, as soon as you turn the page, your eye might have just naturally caught that they're over here. And that doesn't mean you got spoiled. The goal of the page is to convey the information that Dragon and Ivankov arrived to do all this. Even if your eye impulsively skips ahead, even if the first thing you see is this panel, it's easy to put together what happened, that Dragon and Ivankov showed up and saved them. Just as a song's build-up makes the climax more satisfying even if you've heard it before, the build-up of tension from panel to panel makes the resolution more impactful even if your eye has already caught the ending. Chapter 1097 is full of subtle paneling tricks from this, and the main idea I want to call attention to today is how tricks like this can be used to put you in the mind of the characters, to make you relate to them. It's not always tricks that are as flashy as full-page action sequence paneling, but it's just as important. So let's dig into it, and talk about the composition of this wide panel before we jump back earlier into the chapter. This panel is filled with diagonal lines, drawing the eye in the direction it should be going, down with the page. But if you look closely, between Kuma's arm, Ivankov's arm, and Ginny's arm, along with the gun from this random soldier, we are forming a sharp triangle. Shapes like this help give a sense of order to the chaos of an image that has so many characters in it, and this one has Dragon as its center, focusing attention toward him as the leader of the revolutionaries, while Ginny, Ivankov, and Kuma are at the three corners of the triangle, framing them as his key supporters, holding him and the whole organization up. Now jumping back to the start of the chapter, we open up with one of Oda's usual establishing shots because it always wants us to understand where things are happening. At this point, we've seen Sorbet Kingdom a few times, so the architecture and the flora should be sticking in our heads and be immediately recognizable. There's a page later in the chapter where we return to Sorbet Kingdom, and it doesn't need a narration box telling us where it is because it trusts us to remember the imagery subconsciously. The eye goes to Kuma's head and slides right down with the contrast of his arm and straight in the direction that he's pushing in. None of the dialogue on this page actually directly explains that Kuma is pushing pain out. That's the benefit of One Piece powers being predominantly visual. Once we associate a certain visual with the power, as we have done since Kuma first used this power back in Thriller Bark, and as we were reminded of at the end of last chapter, we immediately understand what's happening. If you don't include consistent imagery for a power, then you end up having to explain it over and over, even if the reader still understands how it works, just so they can know that it's being used at all. But we don't need to do that because the imagery is consistent. The next panel sets up a rhythm. It's deliberate that it's 4 people in a row thanking Kuma, just as their speech bubbles are also in a row like this. This is all setting up a pattern that we can break with the vertical motion of Ginny's foot stamping down, just as she's literally in-world interrupting them with sound. Now, Oda uses the usual composition here for introducing a character's full design, as they are sort of overlaid over more than one panel. And if we go panel by panel, then it's kind of weird to read this because you see her head first, and then her body from the back, and then down to see the rest of her full design, which is kind of weird because we should just be able to look at her full design at once. But Oda understands that, because our eye is going from the bottom of this page up here and crossing over her, so we're actually meant to read all of this, all of her new design, before we even start reading this panel. Now, as usual, Oda has a great understanding of what kind of camera angle to use. Even in this small panel, we're still using a wider shot because punchlines work better in wide shots. Then as we start to discuss the state of the kingdom as a whole, we zoom out to an even wider shot looking at the building. It's matching our expanding focus that we're not just talking about things that concern just these characters. The visuals of King Bakori are funny, and it's intentional that they're arranged one atop the other. It forces us to directly compare the brutal way he treats his subject with the way he acts like a simp for the celestial dragons. If this second panel was put over here, then the comparison wouldn't pop out in the same way. Ginny has an interesting expression on her face here, and I point this out because a couple days ago I posted a theory on my Twitter where this shot of her face is an interesting point of evidence. That theory has an expiration date, since it'll likely be either confirmed or deconfirmed by next chapter, so check it out now if you're curious. There's a link in the description. But I don't mention this just to self-promote my Twitter. It is remarkable how One Piece is such a consistently visual story that we can make genuine theories based off of details as small as this one. After all, how many times can you remember where we looked back and something as simple as a character's face in a certain scene turned out to be foreshadowing? At the bottom of the page, we have another good example of the benefits of visual imagery. If the reader remembers how Kuma's powers work and the imagery involved at the end of Thriller Bark, then there is an insane amount of tension here, and none of it needs an explanation in the narration or dialogue. I want you to imagine how a lot of other manga might handle a power like this, where someone can absorb pain and give it to someone else. I think the average way it would be done is through one character touching another with their hand, and then in an invisible way, that pain is now stored within them. They can absorb the pain, and they can give the pain back to someone else. And that's fine, but again, it's invisible. It means that every time that that's happening, you need to have some text to explain to people that it's happening. Or even if context tells us, without the text, that the pain is being transferred, it's not as clear. It has a little bit of ambiguity. This is One Piece, so the power is going to be visual. We are going to represent the pain itself through a symbol, and then we can understand that a character is experiencing that pain through them touching that symbol. There's no more ambiguity, and it's easier to follow that the thing is happening in the first place. Everything here is visual. The pain on his face, the way he's left prone on the ground afterwards, even the way that Ginny can't stand to watch it, that she isn't letting herself be in the same room, is conveyed visually. I've spoken a few times about how Oda uses warped perspective, but there is more than one way to warp perspective. Notice how in this panel, everything is bending away from the center. It's like it's being pushed away by Kuma's screams or maybe just his pain itself. But if we go to the next page, we see the same shot where perspective is being warped in the opposite way. The trees are being pulled inward, almost like they're being attracted in by something warm and positive, which matches how this is the panel where Ginny wants to marry Kuma. There is more than one way to warp perspective, and if you understand the different ways very well, then you can better use them to emphasize the feelings that you want. This page also houses my favorite panel in the chapter. This little shot of Kuma and Ginny through the window, having a good time. This is what this flashback is. We are only able to have outside glimpses, whether we're viewing them through the frame of a window or through the frame of a bunch of panel borders. It's all the same, really. We aren't living their lives. We aren't going through every day, every moment. We are just seeing the tiniest glimpses. We are outsiders looking in. The next page has more of those careful choices of camera angle. When we are delving deeper into Kuma's anxieties, we go very close, more focused on his expression and making us feel like we're really in his head. And when he tries to change the subject to talk about something less serious, we pull away into the wide shot. Imagine if these two were reversed. Imagine if the serious topic had a wide shot and there was a close-up for him changing the subject. It wouldn't make sense at all. It wouldn't flow in the same way. But as that change of subject ends up bringing him to another thing he has genuine feelings about, we go back into another pretty close shot. Now, the final page I want to talk about today is the one where everyone is in jail. There's cool stuff above it too, with how the divide between two parts of the kingdom is portrayed a lot with the shading, but I want to focus on what's down here. Frankly, this jail shot just looks really nice. It's really cool, it's composed well, everyone is sort of between the bars so they stand out, and the bars themselves are almost like panel borders, like this is one big panel ellipsis conveying a sense of time, but also that again we're looking at them from the outside, that we're not there with them. But what I find really cool is how the next few panels go against that. The next few panels pull us in to make us feel like we're there with them. Look at the camera angles. We are looking at Kuma from the left and below. We are looking at Ginny from the right and above. We are looking at their other friends from the left and below. Kuma would be looking at Ginny from the right and above. Ginny would be looking at Kuma from the left and below. Ginny would be looking at her other friends from the right and below. These camera angles aren't the exact angles, we're not literally looking at them through their eyes, but they match them very carefully to make it feel like we are in there with them. We are looking at them from the same-ish angles that they are looking at each other. Like so many things throughout the chapter, it's putting us in the character's mind rather than just showing them to us from the outside. There are a few gimmick manga out there that are drawn from a character's literal point of view every panel, but it's choices like this that use the art of paneling with skill and care that let us really relate to the characters even when we don't realize that it's happening. If you related to Kuma this chapter and cared about his plight, give this video a like. I make videos about One Piece's paneling every week, so if you want to see the next one, subscribe. And if you notice anything I didn't talk about, or want to suggest a past chapter for me to cover on a break week, then leave a comment. Bingo bongo.